For 2 hours and 17 minutes, a thermonuclear bomb burned on a runway in Morocco, 10 times more powerful than Hiroshima, flames licking its aluminum casing. Firefighters standing 50 feet awake, close enough to feel paint blistering off their trucks watching, waiting to see if they would simply cease to exist. The weapon's conventional explosives were heating toward detonation temperature. If they blew, radioactive plutonium would scatter across hundreds of acres of North African desert. The contamination would poison water supplies, render farmland uninhabitable, and trigger an international crisis that could reshape the Cold War. The year was 1958. The location was classified. The men who witnessed it were forbidden from speaking about it for decades. This is that story. The morning began like any other at Sidi Slimane Air Base, sprawling American outpost carved into the arid landscape of northern Morocco, roughly 90 miles northeast of Rabi. The base had been constructed in 1951, part of a massive expansion of American military infrastructure following the outbreak of the Korean War. What had once been empty scrubland now hosted over 3,000 American personnel. Two 12,000-foot runways, capable of handling the heaviest bombers in the American arsenal, dozens of aircraft, and enough nuclear firepower to devastate an entire continent. The pilot scheduled for the morning's training mission walked around his aircraft, conducting a visual inspection with practiced efficiency. The B-47's distinctive bicycle landing gear configuration, main gear located in tandem beneath the fuselage, with smaller outrigger wheels under the engines, always struck him as oddly graceful. He checked control surfaces, examined engine nacelles, verified that nothing appeared damaged or out of place. Everything looked normal. The weather was clear with light winds from the northeast and excellent visibility across the desert landscape. At 32 years old, he was a seasoned B-47 commander with over 1,000 hours in the Stratojet, the sleek 6-engine bomber that formed the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. I had flown training missions like this one hundreds of times. The procedures were second nature, the aircraft familiar as his own hands. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what would unfold in the next 17 minutes. Inside the cockpit, his crew of 3 ran through their checklists with the methodical precision that Strategic Air Command demanded. Every switch, every gauge, every system, verified and cross-checked. The co-pilot occupied the right seat, a quiet man from Wisconsin, who had joined the Air Force to escape his family's dairy farm. At 28, he was married to his college sweetheart and counting down the days until his tour at Sidi Slimane ended and he could return stateside. He was competent, reliable, utterly devoted to proper procedure. The pilot trusted him completely, which in the high-stakes world of nuclear bombers was about the highest compliment one aviator could give another. In the cramped navigator bombardier compartment, wedged into the aircraft's nose, sat the oldest crew member. At 35, he was a veteran who wore the Distinguished Flying Cross on his uniform awarded for a mission. Over Korea, where his B-29 had limped back to base with 2 engines shot out and half the tail section missing. He triple-checked every calculation, every coordinate, every detail of the flight plan. His perfectionism could be irritating, but it had kept them alive more than once. The tail gunner position was manned by the youngest crew member, just 23, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco. His father had fought with the U.S. Army during World War II, earned a Bronze Star in Italy, yet still faced discrimination when he returned home. The young man had joined the Air Force determined to honor his father's service and carve out his own place in American society. He was fiercely patriotic, took his duties with deadly seriousness, and had earned the respect of his crew through sheer competence and determination. He had something to prove, and he knew it. Beneath them, secured in the bomb bay, sat a Mark 36 thermonuclear weapon. 17,000 pounds of carefully engineered destruction. Over 12 feet long, a yield measured in megatons, millions of tons of TNT equivalent, enough to obliterate everything within miles of ground zero. The weapon's design incorporated the principles of the Teller-Ulam configuration, using a fission primary to trigger a fusion secondary. Inside its aluminum and steel casing, layers of conventional high explosives surrounded a plutonium core. When properly detonated, these explosives would compress the plutonium to critical mass, initiating an uncontrolled fission chain reaction. The heat and pressure from this fission explosion would then trigger fusion in the secondary stage, where isotopes of hydrogen would combine to release even greater destructive force. It was a marvel of physics and engineering, humanity's most powerful weapons, sitting 30 feet behind the pilot's seat. The crew had trained with nuclear weapons for months. They understood the protocols, the safety mechanisms, the mathematical improbability of accidental detonation. The Mark 36 was designed with multiple safety features engineered by some of the brightest minds at Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories. An elaborate system of timers, switches, and triggers had to function in exact sequence for the weapon to detonate properly. The probability of fire or impact causing a nuclear explosion was vanishingly small, perhaps 1 in a million or less. But probability offered cold comfort when you sat in an aircraft loaded with several thousand pounds of conventional explosives and enough plutonium to contaminate a small country. The aircraft they flew was itself a marvel and a notorious killer, the B-47 Stratojet represented a radical departure from the heavy propeller-driven bombers of World War II, developed by Boeing in the late 1940s. It featured swept wings borrowed from German research captured at the end of the war, giving it an elegant, almost futuristic appearance. With a wingspan of over 116 feet and powered by 6 General Electric J-47 turbojet engines arranged in underwing pods, the Stratojet could cruise at altitudes above 40,000 feet and reach speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. It looked like it was moving fast even when standing still, but beauty masked danger. The B-47 had a reputation among crews, and not all of it was positive. The aircraft was unforgiving, demanding absolute precision from its pilots. The thin, flexible wings that gave it high-altitude performance could flex dramatically in flight, and structural failures had claimed several aircraft and crews. The landing gear configuration with its bicycle arrangement of tandem main wheels and small outrigger stabilizers made ground handling treacherous. Crosswinds during takeoff or landing could flip the aircraft onto a wingtip in seconds. The engines, while powerful, were temperamental and required constant monitoring. They operated at extreme temperatures and rotational speeds, with turbine blades spinning at over 10,000 revolutions per minute. The accident rate was high enough that SAC maintained a steady stream of replacement crews, training new pilots and navigators to fill the slots left by those who had died in crashes or been grounded for medical reasons. Every B-47 pilot knew someone who hadn't come back from a routine mission. Despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, B-47 crews took immense pride in flying the Stratojet. It was a pilot's airplane, responding instantly to control inputs, capable of maneuvers that seemed impossible for a bomber. In the hands of a skilled crew, it was magnificent. In the hands of anyone less, it could be deadly. The pilot keyed his microphone and requested takeoff clearance. Magnum 37, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 23, the tower controller's voice carried a distinct southern drawl, young airman from Georgia. Winds light and variable. Have a good flight. The pilot acknowledged and began rolling onto the runway. He aligned the bomber with the centerline, checking his instruments one final time. Airspeed indicator at 0. Altimeter showing field elevation of 820 feet. Outside air temperature reading 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Other aircraft were visible around the base. Several B-47s sat on the parking apron, their silver fuselages gleaming in the morning sun. A KC-97 tanker was being prepared for its own mission, ground crews swarming around it. The base was home to the 306th Bombardment Wing, one of SAC's premier units, and operations continued around the clock. Deserts stretched beyond the concrete and less indifferent, shimmering in the early heat. The landscape was ancient, unchanged for millennia. The runways and hangars and nuclear weapons were a temporary intrusion, a blink in geological time. Starting takeoff roll, the pilot announced to his crew. He pushed the throttles forward smoothly. 6 General Electric turbojets answered with a building roar. The B-47 accelerated down the runway markers beginning to blur past the cockpit windows. 50 knots. The nose wheel tracking true down the center line. 70 knots. The aircraft was committed now too fast to abort safely unless an emergency developed. The co-pilot's hands rested near the throttles, ready to assist if needed. At 90 knots, the co-pilot called out, his voice steady and professional. At 110 knots, the pilot felt it. A vibration through the control column, subtle at first, barely perceptible. The kind of thing you might imagine or attribute to runway roughness. But it persisted. grew more pronounced with each passing second. His eyes swept the instrument panel, searching for any indication of trouble. Engine temperature's normal, pressure's normal, hydraulics normal. But his hands told him something was wrong, even as the gauges insisted everything was fine. "You feel that?" The co-pilot's hand instinctively moved toward the throttles. Before anyone could respond, warning lights bloomed across the panel like angry red flowers. Fire warning for the number 5 engine, then number 6. The vibration became violent, shaking the entire aircraft. Metal shrieked somewhere in the wing structure, and through the cockpit window, the pilot saw what the instruments had failed to show him. Flames streaming from the right wing, bright orange against the blue Moroccan sky, trailing behind the aircraft like a comet's tail. Fire, right engines. The co-pilot shouted. Training took over. The pilot's hands moved before conscious thought throttles to idle, applying maximum braking. But the B-47 was still traveling at over 120 knots, with thousands of feet of runway remaining. The aircraft began to slow, but not fast enough. Fire suppressant systems activated automatically, dumping chemicals onto the burning engines. The flames kept spreading. In the navigator's compartment, the bombardier felt the violent deceleration and heard the alarms. He couldn't see the fire from his position, but he knew from the shouting what was happening. His hands automatically moved to protect his charts and equipment years of training, creating reflexes that seemed absurd given what was unfolding. In the tail, the young gunner felt the vibration change to something more violent. Then came the unmistakable smell of smoke seeping through the aircraft's ventilation system. He began mentally reviewing egress procedures, calculating how quickly he could reach his escape hatch. "We're not stopping in time," the pilot said, his voice tense but controlled. "Brace for overrun." The end of the paved surface rushed toward them. Beyond the runway threshold lay dirt, rocks, a drainage ditch. The pilot stood on the brakes, feeling them shudder beneath his feet, but the mathematics were against him. Too much speed, too little distance, too much fire. At the last moment, he steered slightly left, trying to avoid the deepest part of the drainage ditch that ran perpendicular to the runway. If they hit that at speed, the aircraft would cartwheel. The bomber left concrete and slammed into the dirt overrun area. The impact was tremendous. The nose gear collapsed on contact with the rough terrain, dropping the fuselage forward and grinding the aircraft's belly along the ground in a shower of sparks and dust. Metal shrieked against rock and sand. The right wing, already ablaze, dipped lower as the outrigger gear gave way, the wingtip now dragging along the ground and feeding more fuel to the fire. The crew was thrown violently against their restraints. The navigator's head struck his instrument panel, stunning him. The co-pilot's shoulder harness bit deep into his chest. In the tail, the gunner was slammed forward against his station, then backward as the aircraft decelerated. The B-47 slewed sideways, the tail section swinging around as forward momentum died. Finally, 300 feet beyond the runway threshold, the aircraft came to rest. It did not stop burning. Inside, chaos reigned. Emergency lights flashed in strobing red. Alarms, wildfire warnings, hydraulic failures, electrical faults, all screaming for attention. The smell of smoke filled the cabin, acrid and choking, as fire began to penetrate the fuselage. Through the cockpit windows, the crew could see flames climbing the right side of the aircraft. "Evacuate, evacuate now." The pilot screamed into the intercom. He pulled the emergency egress handle. Explosive bolts fired and the forward crew hatch blew open, emitting a blast of superheated air and smoke that made his eyes water instantly. The co-pilot was already unbuckling, his hands moving with desperate speed born of pure survival instinct. "Ow!" The pilot grabbed his shoulder and pushed him toward the opening. "Go, go!" Out. The navigator struggled with his harness, fingers fumbling with the release mechanism. He was dazed from the impact, his movements sluggish. The heat was becoming unbearable, metal surfaces inside the aircraft already too hot to touch with bare hands. The pilot reached down and yanked the navigator free of his seat, practically throwing him toward the hatch. In the tail section, the young gunner faced his own nightmare. His escape hatch had been damaged in the crash, bent metal jamming against the frame. It wouldn't open more than a few inches. Fire was creeping along the fuselage toward his position, the flames visible through gaps in the aircraft's skin. He kicked at the hatch. Once. Twice. Each impact sent jolts of pain through his leg. The metal groaned, but held. Heat was building in the compartment. Smoke was making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Something to prove, he thought. Not like this. He braced himself against his seat and kicked with everything he had. The damaged metal shrieked in protest, then finally surrendered enough for him to squeeze through. He dropped to the ground, rolled away from the burning wreckage, and scrambled to his feet. The pilot was last out, as he pulled himself through the forward hatch. He heard an ominous groaning sound from deep within the aircraft, structural members failing in the heat, bomb bay doors buckling. Through the gap in the damaged doors, he could see it. The Mark 36. Flames were beginning to lick around its aluminum casing. For one frozen moment, his mind calculated the geometry of annihilation. The blast radius of the conventional explosives, the dispersal pattern of radioactive material, the contamination zone that could spread across northern Morocco, across farmland and villages in the ancient Medina of Rabi. Every airman at Sidi Slimane knew what was in that bomb bay. Every one of them understood the consequences if fire reached the weapon's conventional explosives. He jumped from the aircraft and ran, his flight suit already smoldering from the heat. Behind him, the B-47 was a funeral, pyre flames reaching 50 feet into the air, black smoke billowing into the clear morning sky. He could hear ammunition cooking off in the defensive gun positions, popping and cracking like fireworks. Secondary explosions rocked the wreckage as hydraulic lines ruptured and fuel tanks burst. The pilot ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. Then he turned and watched his aircraft die. If you're watching this and want to hear more declassified Cold War stories, take a second to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It helps us keep making content like this, and you won't miss the next one. Base crash response was already converging on the scene. Fire trucks and ambulances racing from multiple directions across the taxiways and service roads. Sirens cutting through the roar of flames. Captain James Walsh commanded the fire crew. A grizzled veteran with 20 years of service, he had fought aircraft fires from England to Guam during his career. He'd seen B-29s burn in the Pacific, watched fuel tankers explode on runways in Germany, pulled burned airmen from wreckage more times than he cared to remember. His hands bore scars from a dozen different incidents, his lungs permanently damaged from smoke inhalation. But as his truck approached the inferno, accelerating across the taxiway with the pedal to the floor, his blood went cold. Through the smoke and flames, he could see the exposed bomb bay. The heat-buckled doors had failed, revealing the weapon inside. Knew exactly what that aircraft was carrying. Walsh had received specialized training in handling nuclear weapons accidents, a relatively new field in 1958. The Atomic Energy Commission had developed protocols for such emergencies, but they were largely theoretical. No one had ever actually fought a fire involving a fully loaded thermonuclear weapon under real-world conditions. The training manuals talked about maintaining safe distances, using special foam suppressants, evacuating non-essential personnel. Textbook procedures that fell apart when confronted with reality. His crew consisted of 12 men, a mix of experienced firefighters and younger airmen still learning their trade. They had drilled for this scenario dozens of times, practiced approaching burning aircraft, deploying foam and water, coordinating their efforts. But practice was different from the real thing. The heat radiating from the B-47 was so intense that paint was already blistering on the fire. Trucks from 100 feet away, smoke was thick and black, full of toxic chemicals from burning jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, aircraft materials, and God knew what else. Visibility was dropping fast as the smoke column spread, and somewhere in the heart of that inferno sat 17,000 pounds of nuclear weapon. Walsh grabbed his radio microphone. His hand trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. He'd faced death before, but never like this, never knowing that his next decision might determine whether thousands of people lived or died. Tower Crash 1. His voice was steady, professional, training, holding. We have a nuclear weapon exposed to fire. I repeat, weapon is exposed to direct flame, initiating firefighting operations, but I need every available unit at my location. Now. The tower controller's voice came back an octave higher than normal, the strain audible even through radio static. Copy, Crash 1. All units are being dispatched. Base commander has been notified. Emergency protocols are being activated. Emergency protocols. Walsh almost laughed. There were no protocols for this. It's not really. Walsh positioned his 6 trucks in a semicircle around the burning aircraft, keeping them far enough back to avoid the worst of the heat but close enough to actually reach the fire with their hoses. It was a delicate balance. Too close, and his men would be burned. Too far, and their efforts would be useless. His crews deployed hoses and began pumping water and foam onto the flames. The initial blast of water created enormous clouds of steam, billowing white, mixing with black smoke until visibility dropped to nearly zero. For several seconds, no one could see anything. When the steam cleared enough to assess their progress, Walsh felt his stomach drop. The fire was laughing at them. Water turned to steam before reaching the hottest sections of the blaze. Foam dissipated in the extreme heat almost as soon as it was applied, the chemical compounds breaking down at temperatures they were never designed to handle. The B-47 had been loaded with thousands of gallons of JP for jet fuel, and that fuel was now feeding a fire that had reached temperatures well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum, hot enough to cook off ammunition, hot enough to Walsh forced himself not to think about what else it might be hot enough to do. "Captain, it's not working." One of the younger firefighters, Airman First Class Rodriguez, was manning a water cannon, directing everything he had at the burning wing. The flames barely flickered. "We knock it down here, it pops up there. We're losing ground." Walsh knew he was right. Conventional firefighting techniques were designed for smaller fires, more manageable situations. This was beyond anything in their training or experience. The aluminum structure of the aircraft was beginning to melt, the wing skin warping and flowing like candle wax, feeding molten metal into the fire. More trucks arrived, adding their water and foam to the effort. Now all 6 base trucks surrounded the burning bomber, their crews working frantically. 12 hoses played across the wreckage. Thousands of gallons of water per minute wasn't enough. The fire continued to spread. It started in the right wing, where the engine failure had occurred, but now it was consuming the entire right side of the fuselage. And with each passing minute, the flames crept closer to the bomb bay, closer to the Mark 36, closer to disaster. Because the Mark 36 wasn't just a nuclear bomb, it was also several thousand pounds of conventional high explosives compounds like composition B and P, ETN, designed to compress plutonium to critical mass. These explosives had specific temperature tolerances, carefully documented in classified technical manuals. If the fire pushed them past those thresholds, they would detonate spontaneously, no trigger required, just heat. A full nuclear explosion was unlikely. The weapons safety systems made that a statistical near impossibility, requiring too many precise conditions to be met simultaneously. But a conventional detonation? That was a very real danger. If those explosives blew while the weapon was still assembled, the blast would scatter radioactive plutonium across a wide area. The contamination pattern would depend on wind direction and speed, but the most likely scenario involved hundreds of acres of Moroccan territory rendered uninhabitable. Poisoned water supplies, contaminated cropland, livestock that couldn't be eaten, soil that couldn't be farmed for generations. And beyond the immediate physical damage, there would be diplomatic catastrophe. Morocco had granted the United States permission to operate military bases on its soilless strategic agreement that gave America forward positioning against the Soviet threat. A nuclear incident, even one that didn't involve an actual nuclear explosion, could destroy that relationship overnight. It could turn allies into enemies, give the Soviets propaganda victories, shift the balance of the Cold War. Walsh understood all of this as he watched flames lick around the weapons casing. He understood that the decisions he made in the next few minutes might determine whether Morocco remained America's friend or became a cautionary tale about the dangers of nuclear weapons. He ordered his men to concentrate their efforts on the bomb bay area, directing as much water and foam as possible onto the weapon itself. It was a calculated risk. The rest of the aircraft would burn uncontrolled, but if they could keep the Mark 36 below detonation temperature, nothing else mattered. The aircraft was already lost. Nothing could save it. The only question now was whether they could save everything else. To understand what was truly at stake that morning in Morocco, you have to understand the world of 1958. Just 5 months earlier, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union had shocked the world by successfully launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. Americans had watched the night sky and seen that tiny light moving among the stars, and they had understood what it meant. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could deliver nuclear warheads to any American city. The comfortable assumption of Western technological superiority had shattered overnight like glass. The implications were terrifying for military planners. America's homeland was no longer protected by two oceans. Soviet missiles could arc over the North Pole and strike New York, Washington, Los Angeles. The entire strategic calculus of the Cold War had shifted. In response, United States had dramatically expanded Strategic Air Command, the elite force responsible for delivering America's nuclear arsenal to enemy targets if war ever came. SAC operated on one core principle: massive retaliation. If the Soviet Union attacked, hundreds of American bombers would take to the skies within minutes, each carrying thermonuclear weapons capable of obliterating entire cities. The goal was deterrence through overwhelming force. Make the cost of aggression so catastrophically high that no rational enemy would ever dare attack. But maintaining this deterrent required constant readiness. SAC bombers needed to be positioned around the globe, close enough to Soviet territory to reach their targets before being intercepted by enemy fighters or destroyed by enemy missiles. This strategic requirement led to the establishment of forward operating bases in friendly nations, places where American LeMay nuclear weapons could be staged and American crews could wait for orders they prayed would never come. Sidi Slimane Air Base was one of these critical outposts, a piece of American nuclear power planted on North African soil, within striking distance of the Soviet Union's southern flank. General Curtis LeMay ran SAC with iron discipline and an almost religious devotion to readiness. His philosophy was simple: peace through strength. The Soviet Union must never doubt America's capability or willingness to strike back. Never doubt that aggression would be met with annihilation. To ensure this, SAC maintained bombers on alert around the clock. Some aircraft sat on runways, with engines running, crews strapped in, ready to launch within minutes of receiving the order. Others flew continuous patrols over the Arctic and Atlantic, circling endlessly with live weapons aboard, waiting for coded transmissions that would send them toward their targets. The training was relentless. Crews practiced procedures they might need if the unthinkable order came. They flew simulated bombing runs against American cities, standing in for Soviet targets. They rehearsed emergency procedures, engine failures, electrical malfunctions, battle damage. They learned to function under pressure, to make split-second decisions, to handle nuclear weapons with the precision and care that such awesome power demanded. But no one had ever trained for this specific scenario. A fully loaded thermonuclear weapon burning uncontrollably on a runway, while firefighters stood helpless and 1,000 people waited to learn if they would live or die. This was uncharted territory. 300 yards from the inferno in the base hospital, the pilot sat on an examination table being treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. A doctor examined his vitals major, Sarah Klein, one of only 3 female physicians on the base. In 1958, women in military medicine were rare. She had earned her position by proving her competence repeatedly against skepticism and outright hostility from male colleagues who believed women had no place in the profession. Their opinions had never stopped her. She noticed the pilot's distress immediately. His pupils were dilated, his breathing rapid and shallow, his heart rate dangerously elevated. "Captain, you need to try to calm down," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your vital signs are concerning. There's a nuclear weapon on fire out there, Major." His voice cracked slightly. "My heart rate is the least of anyone's concerns right now." She didn't argue the point. She understood. Everyone on the base understood. Word had spread fast. Personnel not involved in the emergency response had been ordered to their quarters, but rumors were flying through the barracks like wildfire. Some airmen were quietly packing their belongings, preparing to evacuate if the order came. Others simply sat and waited, smoking cigarettes, staring toward the column of black smoke visible through every window. A few prayed openly. Through the hospital window, the pilot watched that smoke column rising into the clear Moroccan sky, a marker of potential catastrophe, a signal visible for miles in every direction. He thought about the path that had led him to this moment. He joined the Air Force in 1948, right out of Ohio State University with an engineering degree. The son of Polish immigrants who'd fled Europe in the 1920s, he felt deep obligation to the country that had given his family refuge and opportunity. His father had worked the Cleveland steel mills, saving every penny so his only son could attend college. When the young man announced he was joining the Air Force instead of pursuing a civilian engineering career, his father had been disappointed, but ultimately proud. The old man understood duty, understood sacrifice, understood that some things mattered more than comfort or safety. The B-47 program had been brutal. Two-thirds of candidates washed out, unable to master the demanding aircraft or handle the psychological pressure of nuclear operations. But he had excelled, demonstrating the technical skill and mental toughness that SAC demanded. He was supposed to be one of the best pilots in the Air Force. Now he sat in a hospital bed while his aircraft burned with a nuclear weapon aboard. He had been powerless to stop it, powerless to save the aircraft, powerless to protect his crew from danger, powerless to prevent whatever was about to happen. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Back at the crash site, 90 minutes had elapsed since the accident. The fire showed no sign of diminishing. Colonel Richard Thornton, the base commander, arrived in his staff car. A career officer who had flown combat missions over Germany during World War II, Thornton had commanded Sidi Slimane for 18 months. He ran a tight operation, maintained the highest standards of safety and readiness, took pride in his unit's record. But as he surveyed the scene, the burning wreckage, the exhausted firefighters, the black smoke billowing skyward, he felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was the nightmare scenario of the situation. Every SAC commander dreaded but prayed would never actually occur. He found Walsh and pulled him aside, away from the other firefighters. "Captain, give me your evaluation." Walsh's face was streaked with soot, his uniform soaked with sweat. He'd been on the line for 90 minutes straight, directing crews, making decisions, watching his efforts fail. "Sir, the weapon is fully exposed to direct flame now. You can see it clearly through the bomb bay doors. Heat readings are extreme. We can't get close enough for accurate measurements. But based on the aluminum melting nearby, I estimate internal temperatures are approaching critical levels." He paused, gathering himself. "I think we have maybe an hour, sir. Possibly less." Before the conventional explosives reach detonation temperature. Thornton's jaw tightened. 1 hour. 60 minutes to prevent a disaster that could kill everyone on base and contaminate hundreds of square miles of Moroccan territory. "Keep fighting the fire, Captain. Use everything you have." Calling SAC headquarters and the Atomic Energy Commission. "Need their weapon specialists here immediately, sir." "With respect, specialists won't arrive in time. We need to—" "I know." Thornton cut him off. "Need fighting anyway." In base operations, Thornton commandeered the secure telephone line. The call went through multiple layers of command, each operator more alarmed than the last. Verification codes were exchanged. The nature of the emergency was repeated, clarified, repeated again. Finally, he was connected to General Curtis LeMay's office at SAC headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. LeMay was not easily rattled. He had commanded bombing raids over Tokyo during World War II, planned the firebombing campaign that had killed more people than the atomic bombs. It built Strategic Air Command into the most powerful military force in human history. He had faced crises that would break lesser men. But even LeMay recognized the gravity of what he was hearing from Morocco. "Colonel, I'm dispatching a team of weapons specialists from Sandia National Laboratories. They're the only people qualified to deal with this situation. In the meantime, maintain fire suppression efforts and establish a perimeter. Nobody who doesn't absolutely need to be there gets anywhere near that aircraft." "Understood, sir. General, the specialists won't arrive for hours. This fire could detonate the weapon long before then. The conventional explosives are already approaching." "I understand the situation, Colonel." LeMay's voice was steel. "You keep that fire under control. Use every resource at your disposal. Call in civilian fire departments if you have to. Whatever it takes." A pause on the line. When LeMay spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, still hard, but with something else beneath it, something that might have been acknowledgement of what he was asking. "Failure is not an option. You understand me, Colonel?" "Yes, sir." The line went dead. Thornton stood holding the receiver for a long moment, feeling the full weight of command settle on his shoulders. Then he returned to his car and headed back to the crash site. Captain Walsh had rotated his firefighting crews multiple times, giving men breaks from the punishing heat and toxic smoke. Several firefighters had been treated for burns and heat exhaustion at the makeshift aid station set up near the perimeter. All of them had returned to the line. They knew what was at stake. Every man there understood. Among the firefighters was Staff Sergeant Eddie Martinez, 24 years old, from Las Cruces, New Mexico. He'd been married 6 months earlier to his high school sweetheart, a girl named Maria, whom he'd known since elementary school. They'd grown up 2 streets apart, attended the same church, danced together at the junior prom. Maria was 3 months pregnant with their first child. Martinez had learned the news just 2 weeks before shipping out to Morocco. He carried her photograph in his wallet, a small black and white image worn soft at the edges from handling. He looked at it every night before sleeping, wrote her letters about the desert landscape and the exotic markets of Rabi, carefully omitting any mention of the nuclear weapons he worked around daily. Now he stood 50 feet from one that might kill him. The heat was incredible, pressing against him like a physical force, even at this distance. His protective gear was designed for ordinary aircraft fires, not thermonuclear infernos. Sweat soaked every inch of his body. His eyes stung from smoke. His throat was raw. During a brief rotation off the line, he found himself standing next to the tail gunner from the crashed B-47, the young sergeant who'd kicked his way through a jammed escape hatch. Both men stared at the burning aircraft, the flames reflected in their eyes. "You think it's going to blow?" Martinez asked. He didn't specify what kind of explosion he meant. He didn't need to. The gunner was silent for a moment. His face was blank, unreadable, the expression of a man who had already accepted what might be coming. "I don't know," he finally said. "But if it does, we won't know anything about it. We'll just cease to exist. 1 second we're here, the next." He shrugged. "Nothing. That's not comforting, Sergeant. Wasn't meant to be." Martinez reached into his pocket and touched the photograph, felt the worn edges, the familiar shape. He thought about Maria in their small apartment in Las Cruces, waiting for his letters. Thought about the child growing inside, her, whether it was a boy or a girl, what they would name it, what kind of life it would have. He wondered if that child would grow up knowing how its father died, or whether it would grow up at all. He pulled his hand from his pocket and walked back toward the fire line. Major General Robert Travis arrived by helicopter from his headquarters in Madrid, commander of the 16th Air Force, responsible for all American air operations in the European and African theaters. A tall man with iron-gray hair and a chest full of medals, Travis had been fighting fires his entire career. First as a bomber pilot over Europe in World War II, then in the bureaucratic battles of peacetime command. But this was beyond anything in his experience. He found Thornton at the command post, a hastily established position upwind from the burning aircraft. "Colonel, I've been on the phone with the Moroccan government. They're demanding answers. The smoke column is visible from Rabi. Their officials want to know if they need to order evacuations. They want to know if American nuclear weapons are about to contaminate their country." "What did you tell them, sir?" "I told them we have the situation under control." Travis's voice was heavy with the weight of the lie. "I'm not sure they believed me. I'm not sure I believe it myself." Neither man spoke for a long moment. They watched the flames consume the aircraft, watched firefighters wage a battle everyone knew they were losing. "The Sandia team is still 3 hours out," Travis finally said. "That weapon has been exposed to direct flame for 2 hours now. Did technical manuals say the conventional explosives should have detonated by now?" "Every calculation says we should already be dead. Maybe the calculations are wrong," Thornton offered. "Maybe." Travis didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe we're just living on borrowed time." As if to punctuate his words, a massive secondary explosion rocked the wreckage. One of the aircraft's remaining fuel tanks had ruptured catastrophically, the metal failing in the extreme heat. A fireball climbed 200 feet into the air, an orange mushroom that made everyone freeze for 1 terrible second, waiting for the blast wave that would end everything. It didn't come, just the fuel. It's just ordinary fire. But burning debris rained down across the area. Firefighters dove for cover, shielding their faces. When they looked up again, the flames had intensified dramatically. The Bombay area was now completely engulfed. Walsh grabbed his radio, his voice cracking from smoke inhalation. "All units fall back. Fall back to safe distance now." The firefighters retreated, abandoning their forward positions. There was nothing more they could do at close range. The fire had won that battle. Now it was simply a matter of waiting. In base operations, radio operators maintained contact with SAC headquarters, providing updates every 15 minutes. The reports were grim, repetitive, hopeless. Fire continuing, weapon exposed. No change in status, awaiting specialist arrival. The Sandia team was still hours away, flying in a modified C-124 Globemaster transport that had been diverted from a mission over the Atlantic. 3 hours, minimum, probably longer. An eternity when watching a nuclear weapon burn. The base chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, had arrived at the command post and stood among the officers at the perimeter. His lips moved constantly in silent prayer. He clutched a rosary in one hand, the beads worn smooth from decades of use. Several officers noticed and found themselves joining him, even those who hadn't prayed in years. Inside their quarters, across the base, airmen not directly involved in the emergency response sat and waited. Some wrote letters to wives, to parents. 2 children's letters they hoped would never need to be sent, but wanted to exist just in case. Some played cards, the forced normalcy a defense against panic. Some simply stared at walls, alone with their thoughts. A few quietly packed their belongings and calculated the distance to the base perimeter. If the order came to evacuate, they wanted to be ready. If the order didn't come in time, well, at least they'd tried. Beyond the base perimeter, in the villages and farms that dotted the Moroccan countryside, people went about their daily lives largely unaware of what was happening just miles away. Some locals who worked on the base kitchen staff, maintenance workers, translators had been evacuated when the emergency began. They stood in clusters outside the fence, watching the smoke column rise, understanding that something terrible was happening but not knowing exactly what. No one told them that a thermonuclear weapon was burning. No one explained that radioactive contamination might soon spread across their homeland, across the fields where their families had farmed for generations. Through the water their children drank, into the air they breathed. The American military kept that information classified. Need to know. The Moroccan civilians apparently didn't need to know that their country might be about to become uninhabitable. Farmers in distant fields paused in their work to watch the smoke. Merchants in the souk of nearby towns heard rumors and wondered. Children pointed at the black column in the sky and asked their parents what was burning. They would not learn the truth for decades. As the fire raged into its 3rd hour, Captain Walsh noticed something different. He had been watching the flames continuously, cataloging their behavior, tracking their spread across the wreckage. After 2 hours, he knew this fire intimately, its rhythms, its patterns, its hunger. And now something was changing. The flames were diminishing. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. Exhaustion and smoke exposure could do that. But no, the evidence was unmistakable. Having consumed most of the available fuel, the inferno was beginning to burn itself out. The violent orange was giving way to something smaller, less aggressive. Black smoke was becoming gray. Flames that had climbed 50 feet into the air were now half that height and falling. "It's dying," Walsh said, disbelief evident in his voice. "Holy God, it's actually dying." He grabbed his radio. "All units, prepared to advance. The fire is diminishing. I repeat, fire is diminishing. Stand by to move forward and engage." His crews looked at each other, hardly daring to believe it. For 2 hours they had fought and lost. For 2 hours they had watched the flames win every battle. And now the young tailgunner from the crashed B-47 was the first to see it clearly, his position giving him a slightly different angle on the wreckage. "Captain, the bomb-by can see the weapon. The flames around it are dropping." Walsh ordered his trucks forward. Cautiously, firefighters approached the smoldering wreckage. This time, when they directed their hoses at the remaining flames, the water and foam actually worked. The fire retreated. Section by section, they knocked down the remaining hot spots. 2 hours and 17 minutes after the crash, the fire was officially declared extinguished. The B-47 was utterly destroyed, a twisted, blackened skeleton of melted aluminum and scorched steel. Wings drooped like broken arms. The tail section had collapsed inward. The once gleaming silver fuselage was now an unrecognizable mass of charred wreckage. God! But the Mark 36 remained intact. Scarred, discolored from the heat, its aluminum casing warped and pitted, but intact. The conventional explosives had not detonated. The nuclear core had not been compromised. Nobody cheered. The men standing around the wreckage were too exhausted, too stunned, too aware of how close they had come. Walsh stood staring at the weapon, his hands still trembling. Around him, firefighters dropped their hoses and simply sat down on the tarmac, unable to stand any longer. The young tail gunner, the one who'd spotted the flames diminishing, stood apart from the others. He had been the first to see hope when everyone else saw only death. He didn't know why that felt important, but it did. He had come to Morocco with something to prove. He'd proven it, though not in any way he'd imagined. Martinez pulled out his wallet and looked at his wife's photograph for a long moment. The worn black and white image of her face, her smile, the life they had built, and the life they would continue to build. His hands had finally stopped shaking. He kissed the photograph once, then put it away, and walked toward the wreckage to help with containment operations. When the weapons specialists from Sandia finally arrived several hours after the fire had been extinguished, they conducted a thorough examination of the Mark 36. They measured temperatures, collected samples, analyzed the damage with instruments designed for exactly this purpose. Their report would confirm what everyone already suspected. The weapon had been subjected to extreme temperatures, well beyond its designed safety margins. The conventional explosives had been heated to within degrees of their detonation threshold. The aluminum casing had partially melted. Internal components had been damaged, but the safety systems had performed exactly as designed. Multiple redundant safeguards had prevented catastrophic failure. The nuclear material remained secure. No one could explain why the conventional explosives hadn't detonated. Technical manuals, the temperature calculations, the laws of chemistry and physics all said they should have. Every model predicted failure. Somehow they had beaten the odds. Walsh, when asked about it later, would say simply, "We got lucky." Others would use different words: divine intervention, fate, the grace of God. But whatever name you gave it, the result was the same. They had survived. The investigation that followed took months to complete. Dozens of Air Force personnel were interviewed. Engineers from Boeing examined the wreckage. Weapons specialists from Sandia analyzed the damaged Mark 36. Officials from the Atomic Energy Commission reviewed every document, every procedure, every decision. The cause of the crash was identified: catastrophic turbine disk failure in the number 5 engine. A 50-pound component spinning at over 10,000 revolutions per minute had fractured due to a metallurgical flaw that had gone undetected during manufacturing and inspection. When the disk failed, fragments traveling at supersonic speeds had punctured fuel lines in the wing, spraying JP for jet fuel directly onto hot engine components. Ignition was instantaneous. The fire spread from there. The inquiry board examined everything: maintenance records, pre-flight procedures, crew actions during the emergency, firefighting response, command decisions. They questioned the pilot extensively, going over every detail of the takeoff, the engine failure, the crash, the evacuation. Their conclusion: the crew had performed correctly under extreme circumstances. They had followed proper emergency procedures, made reasonable decisions given the information available, acted to save their lives and minimize danger to others. No fault was assigned to any crew member. If anything, they were commended for professionalism and courage. But the incident sent shockwaves through SAC and the broader nuclear weapons community. It exposed vulnerabilities that had not been fully appreciated. The accident rate for B-47s already concerning became intolerable. The proximity of fuel lines to hot engine components was recognized as a critical design flaw. Perhaps most significantly, the accident contributed to the development of safer nuclear weapons. Engineers at Los Alamos and Sandia began designing weapons more resistant to accidental detonation from fire or impact. They developed new conventional explosives that were less sensitive to temperature. New firing systems requiring even more precise conditions for detonation. New safety devices that could prevent explosive triggering even under severe stress. These innovations, driven partly by lessons learned at Sidi Slimane, would eventually make nuclear weapons orders of magnitude safer than their predecessors. The lessons learned that day saved lives that would never know they'd been saved. The incident at Sidi Slimane remained classified for decades. The American public never learned how close Morocco had come to nuclear contamination in March 1958. Even within the Air Force, knowledge was restricted. But among nuclear weapons handlers and safety specialists, it became a case study, a cautionary tale about the dangers inherent in maintaining a nuclear deterrent. For the men who were there, the memory never faded. The pilot went on to a distinguished career, eventually retiring as a full colonel. But he never forgot the sight of that weapon burning in the Moroccan sun. Never forgot the feeling of powerlessness as he watched flames engulf something that could destroy everything for miles. The night of the accident, he tried to write a letter to his wife back in the States, carefully crafted to mention nothing of what had happened, to preserve operational security even in personal correspondence. His hand shook so badly he couldn't form the words. He sat alone in his quarters until dawn, staring at blank paper, unable to write a single sentence. He would eventually write that letter, days later, when his hands finally steadied. It said nothing about nuclear weapons or fires or the closest call of his life. It talked about the weather, about missing her cooking, about looking forward to coming home. Staff Sergeant Martinez rotated back to the United States 3 months after the incident. His daughter was born healthy that August, a beautiful girl they named Elena, after Maria's grandmother. He would eventually have 3 more children. He never told any of them about the day he stood 50 feet from a burning nuclear weapon, touching their mother's photograph, waiting to see if he would live or die. Some things couldn't be shared. The burden of classified knowledge, the weight of secret sit, added another layer of stress to lives already filled with pressure. These men went home to families who would never understand what they'd experienced, never know how close their husbands and fathers had come to simply ceasing to exist. Captain Walsh, the fire chief who had commanded the response, retired from the Air Force in 1968, in his later years. He became an advocate for improved firefighting training and equipment for personnel dealing with aircraft and weapons emergencies. He gave lectures at fire schools around the country, always emphasizing lessons from incidents he was technically forbidden to discuss in detail. When asked about that day in Morocco, he would grow quiet for a moment before responding. "We got lucky. All the training in the world, all our equipment, it wasn't enough. That weapon should have detonated. By all rights, we should have lost the entire base and a lot more besides. But something, whether you call it luck or divine providence or just the laws of physics working in our favor for once, something kept it from happening. I don't take credit for that. I just thank God we survived to learn from it." Colonel Thornton received a commendation for his handling of the crisis. Privately felt he deserved no such recognition. They'd been saved by fortune more than skill, by grace more than intervention. He kept a photograph of the burned B-47 on his office wall for the rest of his career, a reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart, a reminder of how thin the line was between ordinary Tuesday and the end of the world. The young tail gunner, the one who'd had something to prove, served out his tour and returned to San Francisco. His father, the World War II veteran who'd earned a Bronze Star while facing discrimination at home, told him he was proud. The young man never explained what he'd actually done that day, what he'd witnessed, what he'd survived. He'd gone to Morocco as a young airman with something to prove about who he was and what he could contribute. He'd proven it not through heroic action, but through quiet competence under impossible pressure, through staying at his post when everything said to run, through being the first to see hope when everyone else saw only death. That was enough. It had to be enough. For the people of Morocco, the incident remained unknown for generations. Some locals near the base saw the fire that day, saw the unusual military activity, the helicopters arriving, the frantic movement of vehicles, the armed guards keeping everyone away. They smelled smoke on the wind, watched the black column rise against the blue sky. They asked questions and received no answers. No one told them that a thermonuclear weapon had burned for over 2 hours just miles from their homes. No one explained that radioactive contamination had been minutes away from spreading across their homeland. It wasn't until decades later, when declassified documents began to emerge, that the full story became public. By then, most of the witnesses, American and Moroccan alike, had passed on. The desert had reclaimed the runway, the Cold War had ended. The weapons had grown safer, the protocols more sophisticated. But for those who lived through it, who stood in the heat and smoke and waited for annihilation that never came, March 27, 1958 remained frozen in memory. A day when the unthinkable almost happened. A day when luck or providence or physics held the line between life and death. The base at Sidi Slimane continued operations until 1963, when changing political circumstances led to the closure of American installations in Morocco. The relationship between the two nations had shifted. Morocco's independence movement had strengthened, and the presence of foreign military bases became increasingly controversial. American personnel packed up their equipment, dismantled their systems, and went home. The runways that had launched nuclear-armed bombers toward potential Soviet targets fell silent. The hangars emptied. The control tower stopped broadcasting. The runway where the B-47 burned was eventually abandoned, left to the desert from which it had been carved. Sand reclaimed the concrete. Scrub brush pushed through cracks. Scorch marks faded under years of sun and wind. Today, little remains to mark what happened there, just concrete slowly returning to the earth, and memories held by fewer people each year. The burned and damaged Mark 36 was eventually transported back to the United States aboard a specially equipped cargo aircraft, handled by technicians in protective suits who treated it like the dangerous artifact it was. At Sandia National Laboratories, weapons scientists conducted exhaustive analysis. They X-rayed the device, measured radiation levels, examined every component for heat damage and structural compromise. The data they collected contributed to improvements in nuclear weapons design that are still incorporated into modern arsenals. The device itself was ultimately dismantled. Its components were recycled or disposed of according to Atomic Energy Commission. Protocol's plutonium returned to the weapons production cycle, conventional explosives destroyed, casing melted down. But its legacy lived on in the safer, more reliable weapons that followed. Every improvement in nuclear safety can trace part of its lineage to lessons learned from accidents like Sidi Slimane. Every weapon that doesn't accidentally detonate owes something to the engineers who studied that scorched Mark 36 and figured out how to build something better. The B-47 Stratojet continued to serve in Strategic Air Command until 1965, and it was finally retired and replaced by the B-52 Stratofortress. But its place in Cold War history was secured, not just as a revolutionary bomber design, but as the aircraft at the center of one of the most dangerous nuclear weapons accidents of the atomic age. The crews who flew B-47s and maintained nuclear weapons during the Cold War were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were asked to manage forces that could destroy civilization itself, to do so with precision and care, to accept that their vigilance might be all that stood between peace and annihilation, to carry the weight of that responsibility every single day, knowing that a single mistake could trigger catastrophe. Most of them performed their duties without recognition, without glory, without the public ever knowing their names or understanding their service. They lived with stress that would break most people, followed procedures that could not be explained to family or friends, kept secrets that shaped their lives forever. But their service mattered. Every safe mission flown, every weapon properly maintained, every emergency correctly handled. Each contributed to maintaining the delicate balance that prevented the Cold War from turning hot. Each helped ensure that the weapons designed to deter war never actually started one. The incident at Sidi Slimane could have been a turning point in nuclear accident that escalated tensions, triggered international crisis, perhaps even started a war. The contamination of Moroccan soil by American weapons could have destroyed alliances, shifted the balance of power, changed the course of history. Instead, it became a learning opportunity, a chance to improve safety, a warning recorded in classified files and the memories of those who were there, of how close we came. As the sun set over Morocco on March 27, 1958, the men of Sidi Slimane gathered in their barracks and clubs. Some drank coffee, some something stronger. Some prayed, finding comfort in faith. Some joked nervously, using humor to process what they'd witnessed. Some sat in silence, contemplating the fragile nature of the world they inhabited. The pilot stood alone at the edge of the flight line, staring at the burned wreckage of his aircraft in the fading light. The fires were out now, but smoke still rose from the twisted metal thin gray wisps against the darkening sky. Behind him, the base was already returning to normal operations, crews preparing for night missions, maintenance personnel working on other aircraft, ground crews refueling bombers, the machine of Strategic Air Command grinding on because it had to. The Cold War waited for no one, paused for no accident. no matter how close to disaster it might have come. Tomorrow, there would be briefings, investigations, reports to write, interviews to endure. The full machinery of military bureaucracy, analyzing every second of the incident, looking for lessons in culpability and ways to prevent recurrence. But tonight, there was only this: the quiet weight of having survived, of having faced the abyss and somehow stepped back from its edge. The pilot thought about his wife back home, about the letters he would write and the things he could never say in them, about the life they would continue to build together, made possible by luck or fate or the grace of God. Whichever name you chose for the force that had kept 17,000 pounds of nuclear weapon from destroying everything he knew. The weapons we built to keep the peace carried within them the seeds of our destruction. That we survived the Cold War without nuclear catastrophe is not something to take for granted. It required vigilance, skill, and yes, a measure of luck that still seems miraculous. The crew of that B-47, the firefighters of Sidi, Slimane, and thousands of others like them, played their part in that survival. They stood in the gap between ordinary life and annihilation, and they held the line. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as history, but as a reminder of what's at stake when we play with fire. The incident at Sidi Slimane remained classified until the 1980s. It was one of at least 32 Broken Arrow accidents involving nuclear weapons acknowledged by the U.S. Department of Defense during the Cold War. The actual number may be higher. Many files remain classified to this day. For more declassified Cold War stories, subscribe to Shadowworks.